What if I told you that every single act of censorship in human history, every book burning, every banned newspaper, every deleted social media post, started with someone saying, "We're doing this to protect you, not to control you, not to silence you, to protect you"? And what if I told you that the pattern has repeated so many times across so many civilizations that by now we should be able to see it coming from 1,000 miles away? But we never do, because every generation believes their reasons are different. Their censorship is justified. Their restrictions are necessary. This is the complete history of censorship, from the first empire that tried to erase the past, to the algorithm that's curating your reality right now. And by the end, you'll have to answer one very uncomfortable question. Here's what's terrifying. The story doesn't begin in some dark, backward corner of the world. It begins in the most advanced, most organized, most powerful civilization on the planet. Because censorship doesn't come from weakness. It comes from power. From people who have everything to lose if the wrong ideas take hold. And the very first chapter of this story will prove it. The year is 213 BC, and the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, has just unified the warring states into a single empire. He's built roads, standardized currency, begun construction on the Great Wall. By every measure, he is the most powerful man on earth. But he has a problem. Scholars keep quoting old texts, Confucian classics, histories of the former kingdoms, to criticize his reforms. They're not staging rebellions. They're just talking, writing, remembering. And to Qin Shi Huang, memory itself is the enemy. So he issues the order. Every history book not written by his official historians, burned. Every copy of the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Confucian Analects, burned. Private collections, family libraries, scholarly archives, all of it into the flames. Scholars who resist are buried alive, 460 of them according to the ancient records. The penalty for even discussing the banned books? Death. The penalty for failing to burn them within 30 days. Branding and forced labor on the Great Wall. This wasn't random cruelty. Qin Shi Huang had a perfectly logical reason: national unity. How can you build one nation if people keep clinging to the ideas of the old ones? And here's the part they don't teach you in school. It worked. For exactly 15 years. The Qin dynasty collapsed in 206 BC, just 4 years after the emperor's death. The books that survived, hidden in walls and memorized by scholars who risked their lives, became the foundation of Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. The empire that tried to erase the past was itself erased. But the books endured. They always do. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man on the planet, commanding the largest army in the world, with the authority to execute anyone who disobeyed. And he couldn't kill an idea. He could burn every physical copy. He could bury every scholar who carried the words in their memory. But the ideas survived anyway, passed from parent to child, hidden in walls, whispered in secret. If the first emperor of a unified China couldn't censor effectively with absolute power over life and death, what does that tell us about anyone who tries it with less? Now let's travel west, to Athens, 399 BC. The most famous democracy in the ancient world is about to commit its most famous crime. Socrates, 70 years old, a veteran of 3 military campaigns, the man Plato called the wisest person in Athens, is on trial. The charges sound almost modern, corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. Translation: he asked too many questions. He made powerful people look foolish. He taught young Athenians to think for themselves, and some of those young Athenians turned out to be terrible people, including Alcibiades, who betrayed Athens, and Critias, who became a tyrant. The jury of 500 Athenian citizens votes guilty. The sentence: death by hemlock. Socrates could have fled. His friends had arranged an escape, but he refused. He said that if he ran, he'd be proving his accusers right, that his ideas were dangerous enough to run from. So he drank the poison, and he died. And Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city that prided itself on free debate, had to live with the fact that it killed a man for talking. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Socrates. The names of his accusers? Most people can't remember a single one. Anytus, Miletus, Lycon. Those were their names. You've never heard of them. But Socrates, the man they silenced, is one of the most famous human beings who ever lived. That's the cruel irony of censorship. It almost always makes the censored more famous than the censors. It's a lesson that has been taught 1,000 times and learned exactly 0. Here's what they never tell you about the trial. The real reason Athens prosecuted Socrates wasn't philosophy, it was politics. 2 of his students, Critias and Alcibiades, had helped overthrow Athenian democracy. Socrates was guilty by association. The corrupting the youth charge was a cover story. Sound familiar? When governments can't punish you for what you actually did, they punish you for what you said. Rome took a different approach. The Romans didn't just censor individuals. They built censorship into their government. Literally. The office of the censor was one of the most powerful positions in the Roman Republic, established in 443 BC. The censor's job was to conduct the census, manage public morals, and, here's the key part, control the membership of the Senate. If a senator's behavior was deemed disgraceful, the censor could expel him. If a citizen's lifestyle was considered immoral, the censor could strip his voting rights. The word censorship itself comes from this office. But here's what's fascinating. The Roman system was remarkably restrained compared to what came later. The censor served for 18 months. His decisions could be reviewed. He had to justify his actions publicly. The Romans understood something that future civilizations would forget. If you're going to give someone the power to regulate speech and behavior, you'd better put limits on that power. Because the moment the limits disappear, the censorship becomes absolute. And that's exactly what happened when Rome became an empire. The emperor became the ultimate censor, with no term limits, no review, and no accountability. The poet Ovid was exiled by Augustus in 8 AD, and we still don't know the real reason why. Some historians believe it was because of a poem. Others think it was political. The point is this: when power has no limits, the reasons don't matter. The exile happens, and the poet disappears, and the world loses whatever he might have written next. We'll never know what Ovid's next masterpiece would have been. That's the hidden cost of censorship. Not just the works that are destroyed, but the works that are never created, because the authors are silenced before they can begin. For 1,000 years after Rome fell, one institution dominated the information landscape of the Western world: the Catholic Church. And for most of that time, the Church didn't need formal censorship because it controlled something more powerful: literacy itself. When only monks and priests can read, you don't need to ban books. You just don't copy the ones you don't like. Manuscripts were hand-copied in monasteries, and the monks decided what was worth preserving. Entire works of Greek and Roman philosophy survived or vanished based on whether a monastery considered them useful or dangerous. We lost entire libraries of ancient knowledge this way: plays by Sophocles, treatises by Aristotle, histories by Livy, not because anyone ordered them destroyed, but because no one ordered them preserved. This is the quietest form of censorship, not the bonfire, but the neglect, the decision not to copy. The choice to let a manuscript crumble to dust because its ideas were uncomfortable or inconvenient or simply unfashionable. But then, in 1440, everything changed. Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, and suddenly, for the first time in history, ideas could spread faster than any authority could control them. A single press could produce thousands of identical copies. By 1500, there were an estimated 20 million volumes in circulation in Europe. The Church's monopoly on information was shattered, and it knew it. The response was swift. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull requiring that all books be reviewed by church authorities before publication. This was the birth of pre-publication censorship, the idea that someone should approve what you say before you say it. And then came Martin Luther. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. Within 2 months, copies had spread across Europe, thanks to the printing press. The church banned Luther's writings. It excommunicated him. It demanded he recant. Luther's response was essentially, no. The Reformation that followed was, among many things, the first great information war. And the Church's response would set the template for every censorship regime that followed. Here was the playbook. First, declare the content dangerous. Second, ban its production and distribution. Third, punish anyone who possesses it. Fourth, create an official alternative and make it mandatory. This four-step process would be repeated by every censorship regime for the next 500 years. From the Inquisition to the Great Firewall. In 1559, Pope Paul IV published the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It was, quite literally, a list of every book that Catholics were forbidden to read. The index would be updated regularly for the next 400 years. It wasn't abolished until 1966. Let that sink in. Within living memory, there was an official list of books that over 1 billion people were told they could not read. The index included works by Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. At its peak, it contained over 4,000 titles. The case of Galileo is the one everyone remembers, and for good reason. In 1632, Galileo published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which presented evidence that the Earth revolved around the Sun. The Church's position was that the Earth was the center of the universe, not just as a matter of faith, but as established fact. Galileo was summoned before the Inquisition. He was 69 years old and in poor health. Under threat of torture, he recanted. He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. His book was banned. Legend says that as he left the courtroom, he muttered, "And yet it moves." Whether or not he actually said it, the Earth kept moving. The Church eventually admitted Galileo was right, in 1992, 360 years later. But here's the part of the Galileo story that's often missed. The Church didn't censor Galileo because it was anti-science. Many Church officials were themselves scientists and intellectuals. The Church censored Galileo because his ideas threatened the Church's authority to define reality. If the Church could be wrong about the position of the Earth, what else could it be wrong about? Censorship is rarely about the specific idea being suppressed. It's about who gets to decide what's true. And that question, who gets to decide what's true, is the single most important question in the history of censorship. Every censor in history has claimed this authority. Every one of them has been wrong about something fundamental. And every one of them has used their authority to suppress not just falsehood, but inconvenient truth. Because once you have the power to declare what's true, the temptation to declare your own position true is irresistible. The Enlightenment was, in many ways, a direct rebellion against centuries of religious censorship. And no one articulated the case for free expression more powerfully than John Milton. In 1644, in the middle of the English Civil War, Milton published Areopagitica, a passionate argument against pre-publication censorship. His central argument was devastatingly simple. Truth and falsehood need to wrestle in the open. If you suppress ideas before they're even published, you're not just silencing the author. You're telling every citizen that they can't be trusted to think for themselves. "Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature," Milton wrote. "But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself." A century later, Voltaire, writing from various exiles because France kept banning his work, pushed the argument further. The quote most attributed to him, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," was actually written by his biographer. But it captured his philosophy perfectly. Voltaire spent his life demonstrating that censorship doesn't kill ideas. It advertises them. Every time one of his books was banned, it became a bestseller. Every time he was exiled, he became more famous. The French authorities burned his books in public, and the crowd bought more copies on the way home. This is what scholars call the Streisand effect, named centuries later. But the principle is ancient. The act of trying to suppress information draws more attention to it than the information would have received on its own. Voltaire understood this intuitively. Censorship is the best advertising a book can get. Every ban is a recommendation. The American experiment was, in part, an attempt to solve the censorship problem once and for all. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1791, is just 45 words long. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 45 words. The most radical statement about freedom of expression in human history. For the first time, a government was explicitly forbidden from censoring its citizens. Not because the founders thought all speech was good. They didn't. But because they understood something fundamental. The government that can silence one voice can silence any voice, including yours. But even the First Amendment had limits from the very beginning. Just 7 years after it was ratified, President John Adams signed the Sedition Act of 1798, which made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious statements about the government. Newspaper editors were arrested. Printers were fined. The very government that had promised never to censor its citizens was censoring its citizens. Because, of course, these were extraordinary circumstances. The act expired in 1801, and Thomas Jefferson pardoned everyone convicted under it. But the pattern was set. Even in the freest country on earth, the temptation to censor would prove irresistible. The pattern was there from the beginning, a crisis, a fear, a justification. And suddenly the most sacred principles bend. The Sedition Act lasted only 3 years, but it proved something that every generation since has had to relearn. Rights written on paper are only as strong as the people willing to defend them. And in moments of fear, that willingness evaporates. Now let's enter the 20th century, where censorship would reach scales that would have been unimaginable to Qin Shi Huang. On May 10, 1933, university students across Germany gathered in public squares and set fire to over 25,000 books. These weren't uneducated thugs. They were college students, led by their professors. The books they burned were by Jewish authors, socialist writers, anyone whose ideas contradicted Nazi ideology. The poet Heinrich Heine had written a century earlier, "Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also." He was right. The book burnings of 1933 were a preview of the Holocaust that would follow. The Nazi regime created the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels. Notice the name, Enlightenment. The ministry controlled all media: newspapers, radio, film, music, art. Every newspaper article was pre-approved. Every film was reviewed. Every radio broadcast was scripted. Goebbels understood something that earlier censors hadn't fully grasped. It's not enough to suppress the ideas you don't like. You have to flood the zone with the ideas you do like. Modern censorship isn't just about silence, it's about noise. This was perhaps the most important innovation in the history of censorship. Previous regimes had tried to create a vacuum. Remove the bad ideas and hope nothing fills the void. Goebbels understood that you can't create a vacuum of information. People will always seek information. So instead of creating silence, you create a flood of approved information so overwhelming that the truth drowns in it. Sound familiar? It should. It's the basic operating principle of modern propaganda, and you encounter it every single day. The Soviet Union took a different approach, but arrived at the same destination under Stalin. Censorship wasn't just about banning books. It was about rewriting reality. People were literally erased from photographs. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia would be updated to remove entries about officials who had fallen out of favor. Citizens received instructions to cut out pages and replace them with new ones. History wasn't just censored, it was edited in real time to match whatever the party said was true. George Orwell didn't invent the concept of the memory hole. He just gave it a name. The Soviet censorship apparatus, Glavlit, was established in 1922 and reviewed every single publication in the Soviet Union. Every book, newspaper, magazine, movie, radio broadcast, and even weather reports. Yes, weather reports, because a bad harvest caused by bad weather might reflect poorly on Soviet agricultural policy. At its peak, Glavlit employed over 70,000 censors. The result was a society where everyone knew the truth was different from what was published. But nobody could say so publicly. The Russian joke captured it perfectly. In the Soviet Union, the future is certain It's the past that keeps changing. This wasn't just dark humor. It was a survival mechanism. In a society where stating the obvious truth could get you sent to the gulag, humor became the only safe form of dissent. The jokes were a form of resistance, a way of acknowledging reality without directly challenging the state. Every authoritarian regime produces this kind of underground humor, because humor is the one thing censors have never figured out how to fully control. You can ban a book, you can delete a post, but you can't stop people from laughing at the absurdity of being told that what they can see with their own eyes isn't real. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966, was perhaps the most extreme censorship campaign in human history. It wasn't enough to burn books. Mao wanted to destroy the people who had read them: intellectuals, teachers, professors. Anyone with education or cultural knowledge was targeted. They were publicly humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, sent to labor camps, or killed. Estimates range from 500,000 to 2 million. Dead libraries were ransacked. Ancient temples were demolished. Artifacts thousands of years old were smashed. The goal was to create a blank slate, a population with no connection to any idea that hadn't been approved by Mao himself. Here's the critical pattern. In all three cases, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, the censorship didn't start with jackboots and prison camps. It started with a reasonable-sounding argument. In Germany, we need to protect the national culture from degenerate influences. In Russia, we need to protect the revolution from counter-revolutionary propaganda. In China, we need to protect the people from the corruption of the old ways. Always protect. The prison camps came later, after the population had already accepted the principle that some ideas were too dangerous to be heard. This is what makes the totalitarian examples so instructive. It's easy to look at Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Maoist China and say, that could never happen here. But the people living in those countries said the same thing. Germany in the 1920s was one of the most educated, most culturally sophisticated nations on earth. Russia had a rich literary tradition. China had 5,000 years of civilization. These weren't ignorant societies. They were societies that made a series of small, reasonable-sounding compromises, and each compromise made the next one easier until there were no more compromises left to make. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable for those of us living in democracies, because the 20th century showed us that you don't need a dictator to have censorship. In 1873, the United States Congress passed the Comstock Act, named after Anthony Comstock, a self-appointed moral crusader. The law banned the mailing of obscene, lewd, or lascivious material, which Comstock interpreted to include birth control information, anatomy textbooks, and personal letters between lovers. Over his 40-year career, Comstock claimed to have destroyed 15 tons of books and nearly 4 million pictures. He boasted of driving 15 people to suicide. Comstock personally opened private mail. He created fake identities to entrap people. He arrested a woman for writing a letter to her husband about their intimate life. A federal employee, opening your love letters, deciding whether your marriage was obscene enough to prosecute, and Congress gave him the authority to do it in the name of protecting women. The Comstock laws were passed with the best of intentions, protecting women and children from exploitation. But the definition of obscene kept expanding. Margaret Sanger was arrested for distributing information about birth control. James Joyce's Ulysses was banned. Copies of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass were seized. The pattern is always the same. The power to censor for one purpose inevitably gets used for other purposes. Once you accept that some speech is too dangerous to be allowed, the only question left is, who decides what's dangerous? And here's the answer that history gives us over and over again. Whoever has the power to censor will eventually censor things that serve their own interests. Not the public's. Comstock didn't just go after pornography. He went after birth control information because he personally believed contraception was immoral. His personal morality became national law, and millions of women paid the price. That's not a bug in the censorship system. It's a feature. Hollywood's Hays Code, enforced from 1934 to 1968, is another perfect example. The Motion Picture Production Code wasn't government censorship. It was self-censorship, imposed by the film industry on itself to avoid government regulation. The code dictated that movies could not show sympathy for criminals, ridicule of clergy, interracial relationships, or any suggestion that crime might go unpunished. Married couples had to sleep in separate beds. The word pregnant couldn't be spoken on screen. For 34 years, the most powerful storytelling medium in history was constrained by a set of rules designed to make sure no one was ever offended. The result was an entire generation of American films that presented a sanitized, artificial version of reality, where no one had sex, no one questioned authority, and every criminal was punished. It was, in effect, state-approved reality without the state. The film industry censored itself more thoroughly than most governments could have managed, because it was motivated by the most powerful force in capitalism: the fear of losing money. And then there's McCarthyism. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy launched a crusade against supposed communist infiltration of American society. The Hollywood blacklist destroyed careers. Writers, directors, and actors were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked the most un-American question imaginable: are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? Those who refused to answer were held in contempt, blacklisted, and in some cases imprisoned. The screenwriter Dalton Trumbo went to prison for refusing to name names. He continued writing under pseudonyms and won 2 Academy Awards. Think about that. One of the greatest screenwriters of the 20th century was imprisoned for his beliefs, forced to write under fake names, and still produced work so brilliant that the very industry that blacklisted him gave him its highest honor, without knowing it was him. McCarthyism didn't stop great art. It just made the artists suffer needlessly while creating it, and the politicians who drove the blacklist. Most of them are remembered today only for their cruelty and their cowardice. Here's the darkest part. McCarthy's chief counsel, Roy Cohn, aggressively persecuted suspected homosexuals in what was called the Lavender Scare. He personally destroyed careers of gay government employees. Roy Cohn was himself a closeted gay man. He died of AIDS in 1986 while publicly insisting he had liver cancer. The man who destroyed lives for being gay was himself gay. This is the face of censorship. Not principled guardians protecting society, but broken people projecting their own terror onto others. Let's pause here and notice something. We've gone from the Chin dynasty to McCarthyism, and every single case follows the same pattern. Step 1. Identify a genuine threat: heresy, obscenity, communism, national security. Step 2. Give someone the power to suppress that threat. Step 3. Watch as that power expands far beyond its original purpose. Step 4. By the time people realize what's happened, the censorship infrastructure is too entrenched to dismantle without a fight, every single time without exception. In 1989, an event occurred that would crystallize the modern debate about censorship. The Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa, a death sentence, against the novelist Salman Rushdie for his book, The Satanic Verses. Bookstores were firebombed. Translators were attacked. The Japanese translator was murdered. Rushdie went into hiding for nearly a decade. The Western world was outraged. This was a direct assault on freedom of expression. But something else happened too. Many Western publishers and intellectuals began to argue that Rushdie should have been more sensitive to Muslim feelings. It was the first time the argument, "you have the right to speak, but you should choose not to," was deployed on a massive scale. This was a watershed moment. For the first time in the modern West, the response to a violent threat against free expression was not universal solidarity, but rather a debate about whether the writer had brought it on himself. The victim was asked to justify his own victimhood, and a new principle was established, not in law, but in culture, that the anticipated reaction of the offended should constrain the speech of the speaker. The Rushdie affair was a turning point because it introduced a new idea into democratic societies. That offense itself could be a justification for censorship, not incitement to violence, not defamation. Offense hurt feelings. The argument was seductive. Why would you deliberately say something that hurts people? But the implications were revolutionary. If the standard for censorship is someone might be offended, then there is no speech that is safe, because someone, somewhere, will always be offended. The question is not whether speech offends. All interesting speech offends someone. The question is whether offense is a sufficient reason to silence someone. While the West debated the boundaries of offense, China was building the most sophisticated censorship system in human history. The Great Firewall, launched in 1998, doesn't just block websites. It uses deep packet inspection, keyword filtering, and artificial intelligence to monitor and control the internet activity of over 1 billion people. Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Wikipedia, all blocked. But China's system is more subtle than a simple blackout. The government allows criticism, up to a point. You can complain about local corruption. You can grumble about traffic. What you cannot do is organize. The research of Gary King at Harvard found that China's censorship targets collective action, not criticism. You can say the government is corrupt, you can't say let's meet in the square on Tuesday. The European approach to censorship, and yes, it is censorship, takes yet another form. Most European countries have hate speech laws that criminalize certain forms of expression. Germany's Volksverhetzung law makes it illegal to incite hatred against segments of the population. France prohibits Holocaust denial. The United Kingdom's Communications Act makes it a crime to send messages that are grossly offensive. In 2016, a Scottish man was fined £800 for teaching his girlfriend's pug to raise its paw in a Nazi salute as a joke. The judge ruled that context and intent were irrelevant. The act itself was offensive. The European argument for hate speech laws is compelling. We've seen what happens when hatred is allowed to fester unchecked. The Holocaust happened in a country with a free press and vibrant intellectual culture. Surely preventing the next genocide is worth some restrictions on speech. The counter-argument is equally compelling. Who decides what constitutes hate? In practice, hate speech laws in Europe have been used against political dissidents, comedians, religious critics, and ordinary citizens expressing unpopular opinions. The journalist Oriana Fallaci was prosecuted in Italy for criticizing Islam. The comedian Dieudonné was convicted in France for his jokes. The definition of hate has a way of expanding to include things the government finds inconvenient. In 2023, a Finnish politician, Päivi Räsänen, was prosecuted for quoting a Bible verse on Twitter. A member of parliament, prosecuted for posting scripture. She was acquitted, twice. But the prosecution took 4 years and cost hundreds of thousands of euros. The process is the punishment. You don't need a conviction to destroy someone. You just need an investigation that lasts long enough to bankrupt them and terrify everyone watching. This is the central paradox of hate speech laws. They are created to protect the vulnerable, but they are enforced by the powerful. And the powerful have always had a very flexible definition of what constitutes hate, a definition that conveniently tends to include criticism of the powerful themselves. The road from "we must prevent genocide" to "you can't make that joke" is shorter than anyone predicted. And it's a one-way street. Now, we arrive at the chapter that concerns you personally, because you're living in it right now. The social media era has created a form of censorship that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Censorship by private companies that control the public square. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google. These platforms are not governments. They are private businesses. And in most legal frameworks, they have every right to decide what appears on their platforms. But here's the problem. When 5 companies control the channels through which most of humanity communicates, the distinction between private business decision and censorship becomes academic. The telephone company can't hang up your call because it disagrees with your opinion. The postal service can't refuse to deliver your letter because it finds your views offensive. But a social media platform can delete your post, ban your account, and erase your digital presence. And in most countries, there's nothing you can do about it. The platforms will tell you that you agreed to their terms of service. And technically, they're right. But when was the last time you actually read a terms of service agreement? And what choice did you have? The alternative to accepting is digital exile. And in the 21st century, digital exile is just exile. Consider the facts. As of the mid-2020s, roughly 4.5 billion people use social media. For many of them, social media is not just a platform, it's the platform. It's where they get their news, discuss politics, organize events, run businesses, and communicate with friends and family. Being banned from social media in the modern world is the equivalent of being banned from the public square in ancient Athens, and unlike the Athenian assembly, there's no vote, no trial, no appeal. An algorithm flags your content, a moderator in a different country makes a decision. You wake up one morning and your voice is gone. No explanation, no due process, no human being you can call to plead your case. The entire infrastructure of democratic rights, presumption of innocence, right to a hearing, right to know your accuser, is absent from the platforms where most of modern life takes place. We built elaborate protections against government censorship over centuries, and then handed the power to censor to private companies that have none of those protections. In 2022, the Twitter files revealed that U.S. government agencies, the FBI, DHS, and the White House, had been regularly flagging content for removal from social media platforms. Not illegal content, not terrorist content, political speech they disagreed with. Government officials were sending lists of tweets they wanted deleted, and the platforms complied. This was not a conspiracy theory. These were internal company documents published by journalists with direct access. The government of the United States was doing exactly what the First Amendment was written to prevent. And when the story broke, half the country shrugged. The content moderation challenge is real and genuine. Social media platforms host billions of posts per day. Among them are terrorist recruitment videos, child exploitation material, scam operations, and coordinated harassment campaigns. No reasonable person believes platforms should host this content. The question is where the line gets drawn, and who draws it. Because once you accept that platforms should remove some content, the pressure to remove more content is relentless. Advertisers don't want their products next to controversial content. Governments demand platforms remove misinformation. Activist groups compile lists of accounts they want banned. The line moves, and it only ever moves in one direction. The concept of misinformation deserves special scrutiny because it has become the 21st century's version of heresy. In the medieval world, heresy meant wrong belief as defined by the Church. In the modern world, misinformation means wrong information as defined by whom exactly? During the COVID-19 pandemic, social media platforms censored claims that the virus might have leaked from a laboratory. This was labeled misinformation. Accounts were suspended. Posts were deleted. Then, in 2023, the U.S. Department of Energy concluded that a lab leak was the most likely origin. What was misinformation on Monday became a legitimate government assessment by Friday. This is not an argument that all censored claims are true. Most misinformation is in fact false. But the lab leak episode revealed something crucial. The institutions declaring what is and isn't misinformation are themselves fallible. They make mistakes. They have biases. They operate under political pressure. And when they get the power to silence dissent, the cost of their mistakes is borne by the people they silenced, who have no recourse and no remedy. The list of things censored as misinformation that turned out to be true keeps growing. Lab leak theory. Censored, then acknowledged by the DOE and FBI natural immunity being effective. Censored, then confirmed by dozens of studies that claim that vaccines didn't prevent transmission. Labeled misinformation, then admitted by Pfizer's own executives in European Parliament testimony. The Great Barrington Declaration, signed by epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford, was suppressed by Google at the request of NIH Director Francis Collins, who called its authors fringe. Three of the most prestigious universities on Earth, fringe. Meanwhile, the people who silenced them faced zero consequences. Not one person who censored accurate information was fired, disciplined, or even asked to apologize. The history of science is a history of misinformation that turned out to be true. Plate tectonics was misinformation. Germ theory was misinformation. The idea that ulcers were caused by bacteria and not stress was considered so absurd that the scientist who proposed it had to infect himself to prove it. Cancel culture. The practice of organizing social and economic pressure against individuals who express unpopular views represents yet another evolution of censorship. Unlike government censorship, cancel culture is decentralized. No single person or institution decides who gets canceled. It emerges from the collective action of thousands or millions of individuals, each making their own decision to boycott, unfollow, or publicly condemn. Defenders argue this is simply free speech in action. The right to criticize is as fundamental as the right to speak. Critics argue that the effect is identical to formal censorship. People learn which opinions are permissible and which will cost them their careers, and they self-censor accordingly. The philosopher John Stuart Mill warned about this exact phenomenon in 1859. He called it the tyranny of the majority. He argued that social pressure could be more effective at suppressing thought than any government, because it left no law to repeal, no prison to escape, and no censor to confront. You simply learn, through the slow accumulation of punishments and rewards, which thoughts are safe to express and which will cost you everything. And once you've learned that lesson, you don't need a censor anymore. You censor yourself. The data on self-censorship is striking. A 2020 Cato Institute survey found that 62% of Americans said they have political opinions they're afraid to share. That number was 32% among self-identified liberals, 64% among moderates, and 77% among conservatives. Regardless of which side you're on politically, a society where the majority of people are afraid to say what they think is a society with a censorship problem, even if the censorship comes from social pressure rather than government mandate. Consider the cases a data scientist at Reuters was fired for sharing an academic study about police shootings that didn't fit the prevailing narrative. The study was accurate. A New York Times editor was forced to resign for publishing an op-ed by a sitting U.S. senator. The paper of record couldn't publish the opinion of an elected official. A Google engineer was fired for writing an internal memo about gender differences in tech, citing peer-reviewed research. In each case, the fired person was factually correct. Being correct didn't save them. In the new censorship, truth is not a defense, orthodoxy is. The Soviet Union had a word for this. Samizdat was the underground literature that people shared in secret. America doesn't need samizdat. It has anonymous accounts. And the fact that people feel they need anonymity to express their honest opinions in a democracy, the form of government specifically designed to enable honest opinions, should alarm everyone, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. Here's what's truly unprecedented about the current moment. For the first time in history, censorship is being automated. Algorithms scan billions of pieces of content and make instantaneous decisions about what billions of people can see. These algorithms are trained on data sets that reflect the biases of their creators. They make mistakes at a scale that no human censorship apparatus ever could. A photo of a Renaissance painting gets flagged as nudity. A discussion about breast cancer gets removed for sexual content. A historian posting documentary footage gets banned for promoting violence. The algorithm doesn't understand context. It doesn't understand nuance. It doesn't understand humor or irony or art. It just follows its programming, and its programming is written by humans with their own assumptions about what should and shouldn't be seen. But there's something even more concerning than algorithmic censorship. Algorithmic curation. Outright censorship, removing content, is at least visible. You know when something has been deleted. Algorithmic curation is invisible. The algorithm doesn't delete your post. It just makes sure no one sees it. It doesn't ban the article. It just doesn't recommend it. It doesn't silence the dissenter. It just turns down the volume until the dissenter is speaking to an empty room. This is the softest, most sophisticated form of censorship ever devised. And most people don't even know it's happening to them. You can't resist censorship you can't see. This is why algorithmic curation may be the most dangerous development in the entire history of censorship. Previous forms of censorship were crude. You knew when a book was banned, you knew when a newspaper was shut down, you knew when a speaker was silenced. You could fight back because you could see what was happening. But when the algorithm quietly adjusts what appears in your feed, suppresses certain viewpoints while amplifying others, and shapes your perception of reality without any visible intervention, you're being censored and you don't even know it. You think you're seeing the world. You're seeing the world the algorithm has chosen for you. And the algorithm's choices are shaped by the commercial interests of its owners, the political pressures they face, and the biases embedded in its training data. Let me tell you a story that brings all of this together. In 2018, a Chinese student studying in Australia posted a message on WeChat, China's dominant social media platform, criticizing the Chinese government's handling of a political scandal. Within hours, his family in China was visited by police, not him, his family. His parents were warned that their son's behavior was being monitored. The student was thousands of miles away, in a democracy with robust free speech protections. But the long arm of censorship reached across oceans through technology and found the people he loved. This is the future of censorship. It doesn't need borders, it doesn't need armies, and it doesn't need to touch you directly. It just needs to know who you care about. And in the age of social media, it knows exactly who you care about, because you've told it every friend you've added, every family photo you've posted, every message you've sent. It's all data. And data, in the wrong hands, is leverage. This is censorship evolved to its final form. Not the blunt instrument of the book burning, but the precise, surgical targeting of the people you love to ensure your silence. Now, let's step back and look at the pattern we've traveled through 23 centuries of censorship. From Qin Shi Huang to the algorithms of Silicon Valley, and every single case, without exception, follows the same trajectory. It starts with a genuine problem: heretical ideas that threaten social cohesion, obscenity that corrupts morals, propaganda that incites violence, misinformation that endangers public health. The problem is real. The intentions are good. The solution seems reasonable. Just remove the harmful content. Just silence the dangerous voices. Just protect the people. But then something happens. The definition of harmful expands. The power to censor attracts people who want to use it for their own purposes. The infrastructure built to remove genuinely dangerous content gets repurposed to remove merely inconvenient content. The people doing the censoring start to believe that they are the only ones qualified to decide what others should think, and the population, having accepted the principle that some speech is too dangerous to be allowed, has no principled ground on which to object when the censorship expands to include their speech. This is the slippery slope that isn't a fallacy, it's a historical law. Not because the people who start censoring are evil. Most of them genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. It happens because the logic of censorship has no natural stopping point. If it's acceptable to censor speech that causes harm, and if harm can be defined as offense, or misinformation, or hatred, then the only limit on censorship is the imagination of the censor. And censors have always had very active imaginations. The great tragedy of censorship is that it doesn't work. It has never worked. Not once in 23 centuries of trying, Qin Shi Huang burned the books, and the books survived. The church banned Galileo, and the earth kept moving. The Soviet Union erased dissidents from photographs, and the dissidents became legends. The Nazis burned 25,000 books in a single night. And today you can read every one of them for free on the internet. Censorship doesn't destroy ideas. It just delays their acceptance, and makes their eventual triumph more dramatic. The Qin dynasty lasted 15 years. The Inquisition lasted centuries, but failed to stop the Reformation. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years and collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Censorship doesn't just fail to destroy ideas. It delegitimizes the censor. Every act of suppression is an admission of weakness, a confession that the censor's own ideas aren't strong enough to compete in the open marketplace of thought. The strong argument doesn't need censorship, only the weak one does. So where does that leave us? Right here, right now, in the middle of the most complex censorship landscape in human history. We live in a world where governments, corporations, algorithms, and social mobs all have the power to control what we see, hear, and say. And they all believe they're doing it for the right reasons. The Chinese government censors to maintain social harmony. European governments censor to prevent hate. Social media companies censor to ensure safety. Activists demand censorship to achieve justice. Every one of these goals sounds noble. Every one of them is the same argument that Qin Shi Huang made 23 centuries ago. Some ideas are too dangerous to be allowed. The philosopher Karl Popper proposed the paradox of tolerance, the idea that a tolerant society must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. It's a clever argument, and it contains a grain of truth, but it also contains a trap. Because the moment you accept that intolerance must be suppressed, you need someone to define intolerance. And whoever defines intolerance controls the boundaries of acceptable thought. History shows us, clearly, repeatedly, exhaustively, that this power corrupts, not always immediately, not always obviously, but always eventually, not in every case quickly, not in every case dramatically, but in every case inevitably. Because the kind of person who seeks the power to control what others think is rarely the kind of person who can be trusted with that power. And even when the initial wielders of that power are genuinely virtuous, the power outlasts them. And their successors are never as virtuous as the founders imagined. The counter-argument is simple, and it's as old as Socrates. The answer to bad speech is more speech, not less. The answer to misinformation is better information. The answer to hatred is education, not silence. Not because this approach is perfect. It isn't not because it prevents all harm. It doesn't. But because every alternative is worse. Because giving any human being, institution, or algorithm the power to decide what the rest of us are allowed to think has led, in every single case in recorded history, to abuse. The question isn't whether they'll abuse the power. The question is when. Here's what keeps me up at night. In 2024, the European Union passed the Digital Services Act, requiring platforms to remove disinformation within 24 hours, or face fines of up to 6% of global revenue. 6% of Meta's revenue is $15 billion. Who decides what's disinformation? Not a court, not a jury, a bureaucrat with a 24-hour deadline. Under that kind of pressure, platforms don't carefully evaluate each case. They over-censor, because removing legitimate speech is free, but missing actual disinformation costs billions. The EU has essentially created a system where the rational economic choice is to censor everything that might be controversial. And they did it with a straight face while calling it protecting democracy. I want to leave you with something that's going to be uncomfortable. Right now, in this moment, there is a censorship system that you support. There is a form of speech suppression that you think is necessary, justified, and different from all the historical examples we've just discussed. You're sure that your reasons are valid. You're sure that the people being silenced deserve it. You're sure that this time the power won't be abused. You're sure Qin Shi Huang was sure too. The Inquisitors were sure, the McCarthyists were sure, the Soviet censors were absolutely, positively sure. And every single one of them was wrong. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. What makes you so certain that you're the exception?